Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. I am doing another sort of weekend perspective. I know this one's going on a Wednesday, but Aaron and I have got some kind of interesting and complicated travel coming up over the next couple of weeks. And so we are recording a little bit ahead of time. We're recording some stuff so that both of us can be around, whether we're recording or editing or publishing and so forth. So anyways, same Cloudcast you've come to know and get used to. We're just publishing on a slightly different date or schedule than you're used to. So still do Wednesdays and Sundays, just trying to make sure we get all the shows out at the right times. Anyways, want to talk a little bit about kind of an interesting thing that happens. Obviously, as you know, we've been transitioning the show somewhat about the focus of what we talk about. And again, from probably a lot more cloud to maybe a lot more AI, but, it really, it impacts sort of, the technology that businesses are using, right? We're still very focused around what the enterprise ultimately does. And, for the longest time, if you had asked people about sort of enterprise software, it's gone through some interesting stages. Obviously, if you go back multiple decades, you had, very vertical software aligned to hardware back to the mainframe days and back to things like, Sun and, sort of that sort of very vertical hardware integrated with software. Then over time, you saw the transition to more commodity hardware. So you saw x86 hardware, you saw things like Linux, and then you started to see more portable technologies that allowed enterprise software to be more flexible. So things like Java came along, and you started to have this portability and flexibility at sort of every layer of the stack, whether it was hardware, the operating system, or you started to get into the programming languages and the applications themselves. And then obviously over time, as more and more companies were leveraging software and technology to help run their business, whether it was simple things like email servers or ERP systems or CRM systems or whatever it might be. You began to see that become kind of commonplace within organizations, and then over time, as companies realized, everybody has this, it really isn't a differentiator for us. You saw them begin to start adopting, SaaS versions of that. And so you saw, Office 365 and Workday and Salesforce and all sorts of SaaS companies really kind of come along. And in some cases, reinvent a technology space. So, something along the lines of collaboration, like a Zoom or a WebEx or a Slack or something like that. But also you saw the, kind of the replacement or the modernization of technologies that, had been in place for a while as purely kind of software on premises became SaaS services. And what's interesting that we're seeing now, starting to happen, I don't know, and this is where I kind of get into, is this really starting to happen or really just starting to see some of the classic, Silicon Valley, big thinking ideas about what to do with software. And the reason I'm kind of kicking off today's, weekend perspective during the week is I saw a couple of interesting posts over the last couple of weeks, really kind of 3 posts that got put out there. One of them was, talking about how, some companies were starting to look at the big classic sort of enterprise software that lots of companies use. And again, they didn't necessarily lay out all of the ones that they were talking about, but you can kind of imagine, what are the classic sort of software that every business uses. And we're really looking to, have AI sort of rewrite them and try and go into organizations and say, hey, we can unlock you from the burden of the licensing and the per seat licensing or perpetual licensing that you have with that, and we're going to give you sort of a new modern alternative to that. And again, this is one of those ones where it's sort of like when Silicon Valley says things like, well, we're going to go in and just completely transform healthcare, and it'll be a simple thing to do because we're just going to apply software to everything. And you sort of look at it and you go, yeah, healthcare, at least in the United States, is still fundamentally broken. It's a fundamentally complicated system, or we're going to go, again, whatever that thing might be, right? Whether it's online payments or tax, how taxes are covered, and again, some of these things are specific to the United States, but other places they're brittle legacy systems that still exist in other parts of the world. It could be airline software, it could be anything that any of us have dealt with, and so it was interesting to sort of watch that conversation sort of come along, which was like, we're just going to You're starting to see this conversation where people are saying, we're just going to point some very smart AI agents at a legacy piece of software, and it's just going to either rewrite it in some modern language, or it's going to completely rebuild the application, and it's going to, we're going to tell it to rethink it and think of it in all the modern context that we would have now, and take out all of the legacy context. And again, interesting concept. What's the end state of that? Again, to be determined. Second piece of software, the second sort of discussion I saw was this idea that, and I saw it a couple of different ways, but again, the idea was, so much of enterprise software over the last couple of decades, or decade plus, has moved to SaaS. Right, we've seen the SaaS industry become huge. There is a SaaS application for everything. Whether it's your classic sort of enterprise IT back office types of things, or whether they're sales related, or helping you track down transportation. The whole kind of gig economy. Everything from small business types of applications to a little bit of everything. Right, in every single industry, whether it's in construction or legal or manufacturing or whatever it might be. And again, the same sort of idea was, we're going to. Now, this one is a little more interesting because it's a conversation that's been going on here for a little while, and it's really sort of driven more from the idea of, look at the valuations of these SaaS companies. It's becoming stagnant. They're starting to come down, and a lot of the reason for that is because so many of them are promising that they're going to bring AI capabilities to their software. And the struggle with that is that the cost of delivering AI features, whether it's building AI features or maintaining them or embedding them into what people do day to day, is problematic because, number one, in the past, SaaS kind of spent all their money, put all their expenses sort of up front in terms of building the software and going acquiring customers, and then once they had customers, in essence, every incremental customer and every incremental feature was sort of a zero cost, because the cost of hosting it, the cost of delivering that software was very, very small. They could amortize it across thousands of customers. Those customers were very sticky. They were going to stick around for a long time. And what they're seeing now is that they can't just sit there and go off and offer free tiers for long periods of time. The cost of customer acquisition is much more because they're having to include AI features in it. And then if they do kind of hook you on the free tier with that, the uplift that you have to do to get them started, plus the AI features, every one of us is starting to see, there's this bundle, and it's an extra $20 a month per seat, right? And so there has been a lot of talk about can new SaaS companies come out? Can they kind of run the old playbook, the kind of growth hacking playbook? Some of the economics of that, when AI is involved, is more difficult. We're starting to see people, again, that idea of like, hey, I just threw some agents at Slack, or I just threw some agents at Workday, and I created a brand new version of that. And again, they're interesting sort of very Silicon Valley ways of going. If I just apply software the right way to some industry, all of the behaviors around that, all of the economics around that will just crumble. And then, some net new value will be created, and that new value will kind of accrue to, the person that has created this new thing. And again, we've seen this a lot. In some cases it works out very well. In other cases, the economics don't work themselves out, and that's all well and good. And then Ben Thompson had an interesting piece this last week, actually, I think today, but depending on when you're listening to this. It was called Microsoft and Software Survival. And really what he was looking at was, Microsoft being, one of the largest enterprise companies in the world, and for, many, many decades. They've been obviously, have done a very, very good job of having a mix of enterprise software, of cloud capabilities now with Azure, and then obviously they've been making huge investments around AI, and then they're probably one of the most prominent companies at embedding AI into their existing installed base of software, as well as started enhancing that. So Copilot into GitHub, into Office 365, into a lot of other things, right? So they've sort of been at the forefront of figuring out can this transition from kind of classic enterprise software with certain economics that go along with that, and stickiness and per seat licensing and all that sort of stuff, can that transition over to a more AI world where the amount of upfront capital expense to not only build the software, but maintain the software and serve the software out to customers, the economics are just very different, right? And Ben does a very good job of kind of going through and walking through the trade-offs that Microsoft ultimately is having to deal with in terms of, how much are they willing to invest ahead of, ahead of all this opportunity, right? So massive, tens and hundreds of billions of dollars of capex to build data centers, to acquire GPUs, to do training. How are they? How are they monetizing that? How are they allocating capital for that? And then he really kind of gets into, how are they looking at GPU allocation across the stack? And what he really kind of gets into is how much of their GPU allocation goes for their own internal consumption. So their data science teams and their development teams, building new capabilities for Microsoft software. How much of that is going towards the things that they're doing within Azure, so basic GPU services that people like OpenAI and others are using, and what's the trade-off between where they allocate those things? How much of that is for big frontier model things? How much of that is their ecosystem building on top of their software that also is going to consume GPUs, and then how much of it is their internal use to be able to build technology to sort of move ahead of the marketplace? And it's an interesting sort of trade-off because it does kind of highlight a couple things in terms of the complexities of this new world from the perspective of what do you offer as a first-party offering, what do you offer as a third-party offering, and then what do you do to extend your capabilities out to ecosystem partners into different verticals, different use cases, and things that your customers can also use, but also makes your product sticky, right? So it's a very interesting look at sort of the complexities now that are happening with enterprise software. But I think as I think about all this stuff, I really kind of as I often do with these weekend perspective types of shows is try and think about what are some of the big questions that we should be asking ourselves, or we're not, we don't really have the answers to. And I kind of made a list. I think I've got 6 or 7 here. The first one is, this idea of, people are going to start throwing, AI agents, at their existing, chunks of software and allow it to go write software itself. And then maybe that's going to unlock them from being burdened with this vendor specific or proprietary software, or an expensive SaaS service that they're locked into and is perpetual license and so forth, or subscription license. And the first question I kind of ask myself is, how much do enterprises really want to write their own software, right? It's many enterprises for the longest time have said, look, we are in the banking business, the pharmaceutical business, the automotive business, the government business, whatever it might be. Yes, more of what we do involves technology, but the question is, do they want to write and maintain their own software? It's kind of a question of like, they could have been doing this all along, but the market kind of filled a gap that said, many of you have exactly the same problem. Why don't you just buy something that solves that problem? So I think that's one of the first things is, if they're trying to replace their Office 365, their CRM system, their ERP system, their HCM system, is that really the business they want to get into? Because in essence, they're going back to the idea of, I'm trying to make this a differentiator, hence why I'm building it, but are they really offering any differentiation to themselves? The second question I have is, how much do enterprises wish they could write more software? And what I mean by that is, there is, if you think about kind of your classic business, yes, there's going to be a bunch of technology and software that runs back-end operations, everything from, sales orders to marketing to compliance and legal and internal communications and all that kind of stuff. But then there's going to be the software that you're writing that is part of the product that you sell, part of the product that is the service that you offer, the thing that differentiates your business. And in many cases, businesses may actually wish they could write more software, that they could deliver more features or capabilities to the marketplace to differentiate themselves. And so, I think on one hand, most businesses would probably say, I don't want to write more software for things that are non-differentiated. They probably wish they could write more software if the economics, if the sort of the math was now working out where it was like, oh, you could get 10x the number of, equivalent of 10x the number of software developers you have, but maybe the cost of that is only 1x the number of of software developers you have, right? If these agents turn out to be as good as they potentially could be, if they can do what they can do, and they could start to sort of become autonomous, write software, correct its own software, life cycle their own software. So I think that's going to be an interesting kind of dynamic or economics to sort of see how that evolves. The next thing I had on my list is how much do enterprises not understand the economics of owning their own software, right? And this is where I go back to this idea that some company is going to just now magically come along and kind of replace all of this legacy software. At the end of the day, it's always an interesting idea to talk about disrupting some market. But at the end of the day, software is not a one-time thing. It is an ongoing cost. It is an ongoing maintenance. And the longer it sort of sticks around and maintains around, people either become very very anxious for you to keep making it more functional, or they get very frustrated that there is ongoing cost to maintain something that feels like it's got diminishing returns. So it breaks, it's slow, it doesn't work well with some new thing that's coming along. Why doesn't it work better with mobile? Why is it making it so difficult to integrate some new authentication to it, so forth. So I don't think enterprises truly, now that especially since they deal with SaaS so much and they just simply pay a per seat license, I don't think they truly understand the economics of what going back to owning their own software looks like. I think it's been far too long for many people, and they don't write enough of their own internal software, especially software that they don't think about in terms of kind of being an enabler for their own business differentiation. I think that's probably a little bit of a blind spot for a lot of companies. Next thing I had on my list was how much does sort of what I'll call big SaaS or just big enterprise software actually help, because people already know it. And what I mean by that is, if you are a company and you say, well, we don't want to be bogged down with Salesforce, we don't want to be bogged down with Workday, we don't want to be bogged down with Slack, or pick your favorite 10 or 12 SaaS applications that your business is going to commonly run on, because you say, well, look at how much it's costing me per seat, and this license never goes away. I don't feel like I'm getting incremental value every single month, even though I'm paying for it every month or every year. I'm gonna go down this path of letting software build itself for what I want to do. I guess the question then becomes is, every time you hire somebody new, today, if somebody comes and works for your company, they already know how to use Google Docs. They know how to use Microsoft Office 365. They know how to use Slack. They know how to use Zoom. They know how to use all sorts of tools. It could be Adobe. It could be Canva. It could be whatever it might be. And, the idea that you're going to then have to retrain people for, however long they're going to stay at your organization, you're going to add that cost of onboarding for something that, again, what is the differentiating factor of that? And I think, as much as people may dislike, big SaaS or big enterprise software, there is a whole ecosystem of consultants and people that know how to customize it, as well as just day-to-day workers that know how to interact with that software, how to deal with it. There are third-party integrations that just kind of work. And so again, I think that it'll be interesting to see, again, beyond just the idea that, yes, an agent could rewrite some software. It's like, just because you can do something, is that really what we want it to do? Next thing I have on my list is it possible that this new, and I'll call it agentic-driven software, right? The idea of I can take a spec, I can throw it at a swarm of agents. They're going to go off and do their thing. They're going to come up with the best possible, results. They're going to check themselves, and maybe they're even going to, create life cycles around this stuff. They're going to build CI/CD and all sorts of other scaffolding. Is it possible that if that starts to emerge the way that we talk about it, that it could start to create a new type of software community, right? In kind of the same way that open source emerged with communities, right? So if for example, let's just use an example. Let's suppose, in some part of the country, so like New York City or Boston or Seattle or something, people start finding out, maybe as they're bouncing from job to job, hey, that company over there's got really cool stuff. It would be cool if for every other company that I went to, they had access to that kind of software. And instead of rebuilding it themselves or building it from scratch themselves and, trying to recreate another interesting thing that does whatever it is, could we start to see, kind of communities emerge just the same way we've seen with open source, but instead of the burden that open source communities have, which is like, well, I've got to go find people that are willing to contribute to the project and find people that want to, do governance for all these things. Can we start to, apply kind of agent technology to these communities, and maybe we start to see, kind of openness, happen for things that, historically, haven't necessarily, because people said, well, it'll be nearly impossible for you to sort of like displace a Salesforce.com because, they just have so much traction everywhere. But if the pricing of it becomes so, detrimental, now people would argue that, hey, there's already open source versions of CRMs and, Sugar CRM and other sorts of stuff like that. But it would be interesting to see if, this AI and agentic thing, starts to just create different behaviors out there, the same way that we couldn't necessarily have imagined what open source communities would begin with, and how they would evolve over time, and how foundations would come into play, and we'd see global support and forks and all kinds of stuff. So I think that'll be interesting. But then the flip side of that, and this is the last thing I had on my list, was our open communities, today's current open software communities, kind of prepared for the emerging economics of AI created software or agentic-driven software, right? We're already seeing them start to struggle with the idea that they're getting overwhelmed. We've seen a number of projects that say, "Hey, we are getting completely overwhelmed with the number of pull requests, feature requests, merge requests that are happening that are very obviously have been created by AI." And some of many of them are what they call AI slop. They're not great. The content's not great. But it does make you sort of wonder, are they prepared for that? It doesn't seem like at this point they necessarily are. The maintainers are overwhelmed. The people that are looking over the community are overwhelmed because it's 10x or 100x the number of requests to do things. But I do think it's going to be interesting to watch a couple of things. Number one, do we start to see some behaviors happen in which, I saw something floating around today on LinkedIn or something where somebody said, hey, we no longer should sort of accept pull requests with code. We should just simply accept pull requests with ideas, and then allow those ideas, if they're well written, and kind of require that they're written to certain spec. Then allow sort of well-defined agents that maybe have been trained on the code base or on the concepts to sort of write that, and then the maintainers are like, okay, I am kind of controlling the flow of what's going on here, but what I really want is a flow of great ideas, and I'm going to allow agents to sort of be the arbiter. Humans will be the arbiter, and then agents sort of become the worker of doing that. But the agents have been, kind of, further trained, I guess, refined trained for the code base, for the problem space that they have, and it's sort of an interesting beginning way to think about, like, how do we get over the kind of the overwhelmingness of AI slop. But I think the second thing that's going to be very interesting is so many of these open communities, open source Linux style open communities, they've been able to get away with what they do, but they still rely on a bunch of donations from people, but they're still dealing with fairly low cost computing, to make this happen. They can spin up EC2 instances, or they can spin up home labs, or whatever they might be. When we start introducing GPUs and the need for GPU technology and LLM technology to do these sort of things, even with open models, you're still going to need, bigger hardware, GPU-enabled hardware, more compute, more networking, in order for the stuff to sort of work properly. And as much as we struggle with the economics of finding maintainers, of finding, groups that are willing to donate their CI and CD pipelines to help out with stuff, I think, we're going to see some bumps in the road there as well, as just the economics of sort of these open communities and so forth. And again, they're problematic today. They may not be problematic in the future, because we may end up actually seeing the open communities start to figure out better ways to leverage accelerator hardware, to write software such that it doesn't require the most expensive GPUs from a single vendor, and so on and so forth. So, I don't want to paint all this as sort of negative. I think there are going to be some very, very interesting dynamics, but I think we're going to go through a period of time in which we're going to see, people truly understand what some of these coding agents and AI swarms that can do coding and build projects are going to look like over the next couple of years. Kind of harness that, figure out how to make sure we're getting quality out of it. I think we're going to see interesting ways in which communities are going to form around, what this new software looks like, and how much of it should be open, how much of it should be, human contributed versus machine contributed. And then I think we're going to see some very interesting dynamics happen in the enterprise space where, I think a lot of enterprises are going to have to do some, look at some hard things in terms of, what do I want out of the software that I'm using, right? Do I want to be paying for some sort of AI tax in every single part of it, right? Like, am I actually getting benefit out of that? Is that being forced down my throat? Is that forcing me to look at alternatives? Are the alternatives any good? Do I realize what the new economics are going to look like if I go back into a build mode as opposed to a buy or consume mode? I think we're in for a number of years of a lot of experimentation, of a certain amount of kind of chaos, just based on what markets are starting to do as they try and figure out where the future of SaaS is going or the future of enterprise software is going. And I think we're going to see some companies, try and figure out what does the future of enterprise software look like for them as they go through the things of, where do I want to be AI first? Where do I want to be AI where it's smart? Where do I do things that are differentiated versus undifferentiated? And I think it's going to be a very, very interesting space. And it's, it becomes even more interesting when you get these sort of really big, bold, disruptive ideas floating around. You're at the beginning of a technology wave that might or it might not be able to do these things. But you're going to find people that are, kind of willing to be a little bit on that bleeding edge. So anyways, I'm going to wrap it up there. A lot of stuff to talk about, maybe not necessarily a lot of concrete answers, but hopefully some questions to get you thinking about stuff. And I think this is something that we're going to be tracking over the next several years, especially as, again, this combination of new economics, of new ways of building software, of new ways of whether it's copying or creating new, is really going to, kind of be front and center for a lot of this stuff. So anyways, with that, I'll wrap it up and I will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.